Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. In this week's podcast, I have tidbits. I have some updates on my vintage 1960s sweater project, and I have some updates on my venture back into sewing and some revelations that I've had about fit issues that also pertain to knitting. So let's get started. This first tidbit came to me by way of a YouTube channel that I've been watching recently. It's a sewing channel called Vintage Sewing School, I believe is what it's called, and I'll leave a link below. So it's a woman who trained as a designer. She went to design school, and she has an online sewing school, which is kind of an interesting concept, but she also does YouTube videos. And in one of them, she mentioned an Instagram account called Can You Sew This For Me? And what it is that when people find out that you know how to sew, they start asking you, oh, well, you could fix all these, this bag of clothes that I have that have rips and tears, or, oh, well, you can make this for me. Like, they just assume that you can do that. And knitters can run into that as well. People might see that you're knitting something and they compliment you on it, and then they want you to make one for them. And I've talked about this in a couple of different ways in previous videos over the years. And I think that it comes from people see what you are doing as a product. And why would you create a product if it wasn't going to be for sale, or that you wouldn't be willing to sell it? Sometimes, though, with the sewing community, it sounds like people are just expected to not only sew on demand, even if it's not something that's in their particular wheelhouse of things that they can do, but they expect them to do it for free, including supplying not only the labor, but the materials. It's kind of appalling what some people demand or expect. But it's really interesting, and I think, and the reason I'm bringing it up is because there is example after example of people saying no when these demands are made. And then you'll see comments from people or submissions from people who say, well, so-and-so asked me to do this, and because I've seen so many examples modeled of how to say no when somebody makes a request like that, I was able to tell them no. Because if sewing is your hobby, or even if it's your profession, and the same with knitting, if it's your hobby or your profession, just because you have that skill doesn't mean that the world has a right to demand that you provide that skill to them, particularly for free. So if you have struggled with that previously, like where people are asking you to do things that you really don't want to do, and you just feel like, well, I guess I have to, and you don't really want to. It's an amusing account. At times, it's appalling, the kinds of demands that people will make on other people. But it also has a lot of good examples for how you can say no, and a lot of lessons for how people really learned through not saying no and being taken for granted, eventually how that event allowed them in the future to say no. So sometimes you have to live through that kind of experience before you learn to say no. But if you're feeling pressured by people to knit for them, that might be a good account to just look at all of those examples, and so that you can have a way to respond to those sorts of demands on your time. This next tidbit came to me from Edgehill on Ravelry, who gave me a link to this. It's an article, an online article on the story of the Cowichan sweaters. So Cowichan sweaters are, or Cowichan, they're a traditional type of sweater knit by native people in the Northwest area. Like, I think it might be on Vancouver Island or that kind of area on the west coast of Canada. And so knitting was introduced to these people by European immigrants, and then they developed their own sort of traditional style. So I'll have a picture of what a Cowichan sweater or Cowichan sweater is, so you can see it. You'll probably recognize that style once you see it. But it's a really interesting article that I think that you might be interested in reading, and I thank Edgehill for sending the link. This next tidbit came from Christopher CB on Ravelry, who sent me a link to an article on JSTOR, and I will leave that link down below. It's an article about this online digitized knitting reference library. So I have talked about this library a number of times over the years, but I think this article gives good context for where this material came from and who the people were that were behind these books. The University of Southampton in the UK received the collection of knitting books that belonged to Montse Stanley, who I have talked to many times. She wrote this book, Knitter's Handbook. She was originally from Spain and learned to knit sweaters and things based on an individual, like what is their size? What gauge am I getting? What do I want this item to look like? So she had never used patterns until she moved to the UK and saw that knitters in the UK were really slaves to the pattern. And so it was her goal to teach people how knitting works, and so that you can modify or design or do whatever you wanted. So this is my favorite reference book. It's out of print, but it's readily available, used, and it's the first book that I go to when I have a question I want answered. I usually consult several books, but I always look at this one first. It's within reach of my desk. So she left her entire library to the University of Southampton. So Richard Rutt, who wrote a book, he was a bishop, but he was very interested in knitting history. He wrote this book, History of Hand Knitting, and it's mostly centered on the UK type of knitting, but he was also interested in other kinds of knitting. This article talks about how he had a collection of Korean knitting books too, which I thought was really fascinating. This book really is really the first sort of academic approach to studying the history of knitting. Archaeologists and anthropologists never really gave it much of a look, and they often, when they're looking at textiles, they didn't know what they were looking at, misidentified things. Because Montse Stanley had left her collection to the University of Southampton, he has this collection of Victorian knitting manuals, and he had tried knitting various items from those because the knitting instructions were very differently presented back then, and knitting books were a new thing in the 1830s. So it can be a little confusing to try to understand what they're telling you to do. But he had knit a number of things from different books, and so he also donated those items to the university. So they have quite a collection, not just the books. But they digitized all of those books, and they are in the University of Southampton's library, but you can also see them on archive.org. So there's one collection that if you go onto archive.org and in the search you type knitting reference library, you will get that collection of books. If you want specifically Richard Rutt's books, I think the knitting reference library includes his books, his collection, as well as Montse Stanley's. And then a third woman too, Jane, somebody, she had a lot of patterns, like separate pattern books, not so much manuals. For his books, it's Victorian knitting manuals is a way to look specifically at these 19th century books. So those are a fantastic resource, and that's mostly what I have looked at and done research on when I'm looking at 19th century manuals. I do look at other sources. Even within archive.org, you can find books and articles and things in other places, and certainly other websites as well. But if you're curious about these old knitting manuals and what they look like, you don't have to get your hands on a hard copy. You can see the digitized copies. So I'm going to leave a link to that article that Christopher sent, but also links to archive.org with the names of what you should search for if you're interested in looking at those knitting manuals. A couple of months ago, I went to an online presentation program that was from the UK that was about various topics. And most of them, if not all of them, were presented by students who were doing like PhDs in material culture or fashion history, things like that. And they were presenting information about their research. One of the presentations was by a woman who either works or is doing research at a museum. And they are preparing to do an exhibition, or they were preparing to do an exhibition to celebrate the centenary of the birth of Bernat Klein. So he was born in Eastern Europe and during World War II escaped to the UK, and he became a really well-known textile designer in the UK. I believe his birthday is in April, and so they have started posting things online to the various social media feeds that I get, like Fleece to Fashion, which is from the University of Glasgow. I have been posting things about Bernat Klein in the past week or two. And one of the things that they posted was a movie. I think it's like 20 or 30 minutes long, and it's about the Scottish border towns. So this area of England's Scotland that's border, and it's very natural, wild landscape. It's very beautiful. And they're talking about the various different things that people do in that area. At the 6-minute, 3-second mark, they start talking about textiles. And so they have, sheep, and they're showing these looms and all that kind of thing going on. And then at the 15-minute mark, they are showing this landscape, and they're showing somebody painting in the landscape, painting a canvas outside using color in a really interesting way, and it's Bernat Klein. So they are kind of showing him. I don't believe that they mention who he is in that movie, but whoever linked to this movie knew that he was in it. So if that is something that's of interest to you, the whole video might be interesting. But if you're interested specifically in the textiles or in Bernat Klein, you might be interested in that video. Now, when I first heard the name Bernat Klein and that he had a yarn company, I thought the yarn company was Bernat, which is a company we have here in North America. It's not. It's completely unrelated. They are separate companies. I think his name or his label was Bernat Klein. It wasn't just Bernat. So if that's something that you're thinking, oh, is that who that was? Different company. Speaking of Bernat Klein, he was the reason that I started knitting this particular sweater. It's kind of a chain of events. So when I first heard about Bernat Klein a few months ago, one of the things that they mentioned was that he was a pioneer in textiles and in terms of texture, but also color. He came up with some really innovative ways of doing space-dyed yarn. And eventually, he started a yarn company. His wife was a knitter. She designed all the patterns, and she ran that part of the business. And one of the things that they mentioned in the presentation was that they created kits where you'd get a sweater's quantity worth of yarn and the pattern, and then a skirt length worth of fabric to coordinate it, that would coordinate with it. And I thought, well, that was genius. That's amazing. And they also mentioned, his yarn was really a high-end yarn. This is like really upscale yarn. So I thought he invented this whole concept. And I talked about it after I'd watched the presentation. I talked about it on a Casual Friday. And somebody in the Ravelry group the next day said, oh, those kits were super popular in the 60s and 70s. It wasn't just him. She said, in fact, I just bought a kit off eBay yesterday. And I was, what? Oh my gosh, because I, collect vintage books. I do sometimes buy vintage yarn just so I can understand what it is. And I've got this long-term project of knitting a sweater from each decade of the 20th century. And one of the things that is a struggle, especially in the first half of the century, is understanding what the yarn is that they're calling for, because obviously discontinued, but a lot of times they'll use a name for yarn that was very common, like a type of yarn that is just not something we know about today. So that's always a challenge. So I was just fascinated with the idea of a vintage knitting kit that would have the yarn and the pattern and this fabric. Like, I thought that was so amazing. So I went on eBay and I actually found a Bernat Klein kit, but it was $200. It was yellow mohair and the fabric was yellow and Kelly green. And I was like, I just can't do that. So I kept looking and I found 3 kits. The first one I found, I was so excited to find it, and it was an actual auction. It wasn't just a buy now thing, it was an auction thing. So I put a bid on it. And that was this kit right here, this kind of coral colored yarn and the fabric. This is not anything a color that I would wear. It was so fascinating to see that it had these matching buttons and grosgrain ribbon with it. And this kit was actually totally complete. It came with 2 patterns, and it's fine gauge sweaters, plain stockinette. One of them I thought was super boring, but the other one I thought was really interesting looking in the construction of it. And I thought, oh, as soon as I saw that pattern, I thought that is interesting. So I kept looking. I found another kit, same company, Andrew Stewart was the name of the company. This one was a color that I actually liked better. It's kind of blue-green, and you'll see that there is also this label here. So it's a label that says the fabric is hand woven, and you can sew that into your skirt. So, and this one actually also included a photograph of the weaver who made the cloth. So this cloth is like 28 inches wide and then 1.75 yards in length. That's what a skirt length is. Well, now this kit was missing. It only had 5 balls of yarn. I knew it only had 5 balls when I ordered it. I didn't really care. I just wanted the kit. It's like, when I buy, some of these old vintage books, they might be in really bad shape. I don't care. I just want the book. So, and it doesn't mean I'm going to knit anything from it. I just want to look at it. And there's no patterns in this. So I think somebody started it, used up 3 balls of yarn, probably knit the back of the sweater, which is probably super boring, and it's all stockinette, and then put it to the side. And so this is what was left over that somebody got their hands on at some point, and they bought it. So I like the color better, not enough yarn to make a sweater. If potentially I could find a coordinating color, which is not as easy as you'd think, because the colors that they were making then are not like the colors that they make now. And so finding something that coordinates is tricky. So I found a third kit from a different company called Isle of Butte. And this kit had all of the yarn, 8 balls of yarn, and it had fabric. And so that is the yarn that I am using. Now this kit was probably from the 70s because the yardage is still 1 3/4 yards, but the yarn is 50-gram balls. And so it's like that early part of the 70s where they're transitioning to the metric system in the UK. So things that were by weight were transitioned to metric, but things that were by length were still in the imperial system. So this is the fabric that came with the yarn. So this yarn, so I decided to use that sweater pattern that I like so much. I read through it. I thought it was fascinating construction. The gauge for the yarn it was meant for was 8 stitches per inch. And the gauge for this particular yarn is more like 7.5 stitches per inch, just because it's a 4-ply fingering weight yarn, not a 3-ply light fingering weight yarn. So I had to do some adjustments for that. But because of that, because I want to make the skirt that goes with this sweater. It doesn't come with a sewing pattern. So I just haven't sewn much in the past few years, and I was never a great sewer. It's like the way I learned to sew is the way I learned to cook and the way I originally learned to knit, which is just follow the directions. They tell me what to get, what materials I need, and I follow the directions. And if they don't say it in the pattern, then I don't know to do it. so that's how my sewing has been. You know, my knitting progressed. I became a master hand knitter. I know how to design. I know how to modify. I know how knitting actually works. So I can bend it to my will. And I've always thought I'd really like to be able to do that with sewing, to understand sewing better. When I reorganized, I moved into this bigger room for my office. One of the things that I kept thinking about was maybe I would have room for my sewing machine in here. I didn't want to be too crowded in here, but I wanted to maybe be able to have my sewing machine in here, or at least have access to it easily. Once I saw that I was going to have this skirt, I thought, oh, that's perfect reason for me to really bring my sewing machine up and really get to know it better and really learn how my machine works, not just how do I use my machine, but really learn how the machine works and learn more about other techniques. What I knew was that this is the only fabric I have for this. I can't screw this up. So I would need to make some practice skirts and figure out, first of all, I've never knit with wool before. And so to see how that might be different. And I'll probably need to do a lining for this, or I would like to do a lining for this as well. So I started looking around, and I think it's the same discovery that many knitters who have come back to knitting in the past year, maybe they've been away from it for 10 or 15 years, they come back to it and they're just amazed at the resources that are available for learning and expanding your knowledge. And that's how I feel about sewing, is that there's so much out there that I didn't even think to ask about, that I'm just being told. And if I have a question, I have multiple sources. I can look at it in multiple places until I get a better picture of who really knows what they're talking about versus who's probably just repeating what they've heard and don't really understand it or don't give any nuance to the instruction. So I'm really looking for people who are really expert, who are good teachers, and who can provide some nuance. So I'm starting to find those people, which is really great. Some of them have YouTube channels, some of them have craftsy classes that I've been devouring. So that's been really great. And I have to thank that presentation on Bernat Klein. Otherwise, I wouldn't be where I am right now in terms of this particular adventure. I don't remember if last week I had finished the right front of the sweater. So the way that this is a cardigan, so you do the back, then you do the right fronts, and you can see that there is this very wide angle right here. So that's going to get filled in with ribbing, and it's going to create kind of a very, not really a shawl color that can fold over like this, but more like something that kind of creates a V and kind of hugs. I'll put a picture of what it's going to look like up there. One of the things that I have been worried about is whether or not I actually have enough of this yarn. One of the things that I do before I start any project is create a spreadsheet. And I've talked about this a lot of times. I get a lot of questions about it. I've gone through examples of different ways I use spreadsheets and how I set them up in a couple of previous videos, which I'll link to up here and down in the show notes. And so there are a couple of different things that I want to know or that I can use a spreadsheet for, but oftentimes a specific project will lead me to use a spreadsheet in a way that I don't typically use it. But one of the things that I use a spreadsheet for, particularly for vintage projects and for things where I'm designing myself and I don't know how many yards of yarn I'm supposed to have. I can estimate, but I don't know because I'm not being told. Either I'm designing it, I'm the one who's supposed to be telling other people if I were creating it as a pattern that I was publishing, but it's something I need to know so that I know I have enough yarn. So I go through the pattern and basically line by line, I'm looking at the instructions like cast on this many stitches. How many rows of ribbing am I going to be working? And so that's how many stitches I have per row. This is how many rows I'm knitting it, and this is how many stitches that is. And then the next section, oh, now I'm switching needles to stockinette, and I'll make a little note in my spreadsheet. How many rows am I doing with the same stitch count? Oh, now here's an increased row. And so every time I have a shaping issue, I create a new line in my spreadsheet and I have the current stitch count reflected in that. And I'm always keeping a running total of the stitches. So by the end, after I've gone through every one of the pieces, I have a grand total of stitches. I know how many stitches this project has. And at this point, I've done enough spreadsheets and I've seen my knitting habits long enough to know that my 3-week tolerance of working on the same project exclusively works out to about 55,000 stitches, which for, you know, a pretty simple worsted weight sweater, I might be able to get the whole thing done in 3 weeks. But for something that's longer or has more stitches because it's complex cable patterns, or just because it is complex cable patterns will take longer to knit each row, that I can tell by looking at the total number of stitches, oh, this is going to be a project I can get done in 3 weeks, or this is going to be one where I'm going to have to take a break. Sometimes I take a break because things are going wrong and I just need a timeout. But that kind of information I've learned because I've done so many spreadsheets. I can use that data to give me some information before I even cast on any stitches. So then when I'm actually knitting, as I get through the first ball of yarn, I look at how many stitches I got from that ball of yarn. And then I look at, you know, when I get done with the second ball. And I can compare that to the number of balls of yarn I have and the total number of stitches. Am I going to have enough yarn? So if I'm using a modern yarn that's readily available and I don't think I have enough yarn, I know to go buy some more. So I'll do that with blankets. A lot of times I always underestimate. Even when I think I'm padding, I underestimate the amount of yarn I'm going to need. And so I need to get through that first ball or two pretty quickly so that I know I can still get the same dye lot. So with the vintage patterns, when I'm using modern yarns and I'm trying to guess at is this the equivalent and what the yardage would have been like, because yardage can be affected based on the construction of the yarn. So a yarn that's very light and lofty, you might get more yards per ounce or gram. So if I'm using a yarn that has a tighter twist and denser construction, I might need more ounces of it because there are fewer yards per ounce, even if it's the same yarn weight where it's the same thickness. So these are things that I need to worry about with the vintage sweaters. Because I was a little concerned about whether or not I was going to have enough yarn, I had a plan that I would work the sleeves either completely top down or mostly top down. I had 2 ideas and I was going to swatch for them. So I'll do an overhead and kind of show you what my ideas were and then what I've decided based on the swatching. So here's the schematic that I drew for the front of my sweater. So this is that big diagonal line that goes from the center of the front all the way over to the edge. And what you'll see here with this sleeve is that it's a set-in sleeve, but it's a set-in sleeve that has a slightly unusual construction. These days, for a set-in sleeve, you'd have a larger bind off, and then you'd have a pretty quick amount of decreasing to create a curve here, and then you'd go straight up. So this is another thing that's interesting about this construction that made me want to knit the sweater. This is the part that really made me want to knit it. This angle right here is done by decreasing a couple stitches from the edge every right side row. And so for this side of the sweater, you are doing a decrease that angles to the right. That's a knit 2 together. For the left side of the sweater, where the sleeve's going to be going this way, you're going to use a left-leaning decrease. Would be an SSK. So this line right here is replicated on the sleeve. So this is what the sleeve cap looks like. Again, you have this tiny, tiny bind off here. It's like 4 stitches, ½ an inch. And then you have that same angle right here. So again, you are working your decreases so that they are leaning in the same direction as the edge is leaning on each side, 2 stitches away from the edge. And then when you get up to here, it switches to the decrease rate is the same, but they switch it to being at the edge so that when it's seamed, you don't see it. So these decreases are meant to be seen on both sides, and they're going to be lined up together. And these are meant to not be seen. So the issue with knitting this sleeve top down is that instead of doing decreases in this direction, I'd be doing increases in this direction. And if the idea is for the shaping not to be hidden in the edge and not be seen, I'd have to figure out a way to do that there. But then you have the increases 2 stitches away from the edge, and they're meant to be seen, but they're also meant to mirror what's going on in the body. And that was the concern I had for knitting this top down. So I did some swatches. I'm going to show you what they look like. This replicates the body. So you have some decreases for a while, and you can see that they're 2 stitches away from the edge. I've got 2 plain stockinette stitches, and then the 3rd stitch is the knit 2 together. And then it goes straight up. What you can see here is then you have your decreases over here. So when these are sewn together, you won't see the selvage. The selvage stitch on each edge will disappear so that you'll have 1 plain stockinette stitch, and then you'll have that line of decreases. So this is what raglan shaping looks like. A lot of people are only familiar with raglan sweaters knit top down seamlessly, but raglan sweaters can be knit bottom up or top down, seamlessly or not seamlessly. So this would be how a raglan sweater would be knit, but you would extend the seams on both the body and the sleeve. You would continue this shaping all the way up to the shoulder. And in this case, it's only done for part of the underarm. And then on this one, you can see where I put the decreases right in the edge. And then they were doing them every other row for a while, and then they do them every row at the very top right before you do some bind off. So that is what creates the shape that's going to fit into here. So how do you do that top down? Increases don't look like upside down decreases. They create the reverse shaping, but they don't create the reverse appearance in the fabric. So there is one exception, which is that a lifted increase can look like an upside down decrease mostly. So this was knit. I knit this top down, and I was playing around with how I would do the increases so that they wouldn't, they could be hidden in the edge. And then I worked them. So if you look at it in this direction, this looks like an SSK. Unless you look at it super close, where you'll see that for every long edge here, you have one strand here, and then you'll have 2 strands here, because that's the increase line. So it sort of mimics, it does a pretty good job of mimicking the decrease line, but there's one other problem, which is that this looks like a stitch that has 1 long leg and 2 short legs. But then if you look at the next column, you'll see then, oh, there's 1 more column of stitches. Well, then you have a half a column. And that's because when I actually did these, I have 2 columns of stitches, and the increase is actually this long leg, and then the new stitch is, coming out that way. So what you see in this direction isn't really what was made. So the problem with seaming this would be that you could only use half a stitch on one edge of the sleeve, and then you'd use a full stitch on this other edge in order to get something that looked the same as if it were all knit bottom up together. So it worked okay. I wasn't really super happy with the whole increase in the edge situation over here. And even though this mimics an SSK pretty well, I'm not happy doing that. So what I'm going to do is use a provisional cast on, like Judy's Magic Cast On, right at the base of the sleeve cap. Knit it from the bottom up so that it matches this side perfectly. And then I'll come back to that cast on, and then I'll just work the sleeve top down from there. It will work just as well, and I will get exactly the shaping that I want to mirror this particular edge. I told you a little bit about some of the sewing things I've got going on, why I'm getting back into sewing. So I wanted to share with you what I did with sewing this week. So because I do have sewing experience, but I was never like an excellent seamstress, I have a lot of basic knowledge about how to sew. So a lot of what I've been doing is research and watching videos and reading articles and reading books, and I've been buying a couple of books as well. So, and now that I have gotten to know my serger a little better, I'm really having fun with it. I found out that my serger is it's also called an overlock machine. So if you look at commercially sewn fabrics, the way the seams look, the edges are all finished off. There's like tons of threads that are surrounding the edges. That's what a serger does. It finishes edges like that. For knit fabrics, you can actually sew and finish the edges at the same time. My serger, I bought it in like 2009. So it's a white Superlock 2000 ATS, I think is the name of it. And there's very little information I could find out about it online, like how things work, tips about it. What I discovered was that the white company, was bought by Husqvarna Viking. And so that serger was very minorly changed. The couple little tweaks were made to it, but it was then part of their low-end serger line. And once I discovered that, then I could find more information. In particular, there's a website called sewingmastery.com. Really great. She used to, I think, travel as a sewing machine or serger rep for some company. I don't know. She used to travel and teach and do demonstrations and whatever. But she lives in South Dakota, and she has her own sewing machine showroom. And so her channel has demonstrations of so many different kinds of sewing machines. And one of the things that she demonstrated was the Husqvarna Viking version of my serger. So there are just two tiny, tiny things that were slightly different. But it made such a world of difference. Basically what she does is she goes through the manual page. She does a video for each page of the manual. You wouldn't know that necessarily by the way that she demonstrates it. She'll open the box, she'll take it out, she'll explain what's in there, and then she just goes through setting up the machine, showing you how to do this, showing you how to do that. So one of the things that I've been struggling with my serger is threading it, not threading it from the spool all the way through all of the mechanics, but actually getting it through the thread through the holes, because there's 4 threads and everything's kind of all together. And I tried so many different kinds of needle threaders. They weren't working, but it was like so hard. And I saw her video and watched her thread it. Some people use this technique where they'll cut the threads, and when they need to put a new thread on, they'll tie the new thread to the old thread and just pull it through, so then they don't have to thread anything. And to me, that seemed like it just takes just as long as threading it. The hard part is getting it through the holes. So she went through and she was showing how to use the tweezers, which are a big part of a serger. And just the tricky part, the things that I found tricky about threading this particular serger, she showed like, okay, a lot of people find this part tricky, but you just do this, and then it hooks around there, and then you turn the hand wheel, and then it brings things over here, and then you can just use your tweezers to help you thread. And once I saw that she was using her tweezers to thread it, like using it as an extension of fingers, huge difference. Big fan of Sewing Mastery. I thought I want to make myself some t-shirts. I wear t-shirts a lot, and long sleeve, short sleeve, all year round. And I haven't bought any in a few years. I thought that might be something I could do with my serger. sew some t-shirts. So watch some videos. I actually had some knit fabric that I bought years ago, white knit fabric. I intended to just do this as a mock-up, just as a practice. I found a sewing pattern. It was a free PDF I'll leave below for, it's from a company called Do It Better Yourself, DIBY. And it's a free t-shirt pattern. It's for beginners, apparently. You can do it on your sewing machine, but I did it on my serger. And like everything just worked. And I thought, geez, I have muscle memory for stretch and sew. Like I knew how much to do it. So this is not quite done. I have to do the hems on the sleeves. And I did do the hem on the bottom on my sewing machine using what's called a twin needle. And I was having some issues with that, so I have to get that fixed up. I like the way it fits, and the other thing about it was this t-shirt pattern was for kind of a long t-shirt that kind of comes down to like your full hip area, and I didn't want anything that long. The t-shirts I do have don't stay tucked in very well, and so I wanted something longer than what I have, but not as long as the pattern. And so from all of the learning that I've done, I figured out how to adjust the pattern by, shortening it and then grading the lines to smooth things out. So this is a PDF pattern. So I learned all about the PDF patterns where you print them out and then tape them together and then cut out your size. And it's just so much fun to see all of the different things that are available now to people who sew, and how you can buy a pattern and download it and just get started on it right away. And you don't have to go to a fabric store and like page through the books and, with your mask on and hope that that somebody else isn't using the book that you want to use, and then hope that they're not out of stock of the size that you need of the pattern that you want. So that was really fun. So I really liked this. There was one thing I didn't like about the bottom of the scoop. I kind of felt like was coming out a little much. So I think it just has to do with how wide this band is and trying to come around the inside of a curve. I think if I had a narrower band, then there wouldn't be so much difference in the circumference of the edge, because I looked at the photo of like the gallery of photos of this particular project, and they're people, it's a really size inclusive line of patterns, and so they have people of all different shapes and sizes, but some of those people have a chest that comes out, and so the collar is kind of laying a little flatter on their body. But I looked at the picture of the designer who was wearing it, and she's closer to my size, and I'm like, oh, actually my collar looks a little better than hers does. So I think it's just how wide it is, but maybe not. Maybe if some of you have made that and have seen that before, you might have some tips. But I'm really happy. This pattern comes in different sleeve lengths, and it has different kinds of necks too. There's like a crew neck, so it's a higher neck, and then I like a scoop neck. But sometimes I like a crew neck, especially if I'm wearing it under a sweater that has a crew neck. I want something else. This is getting me back into doing sewing knits, which I like having practice on that. Then the other thing that I was working on, there's a Craftsy class by Susie Furrer, who she teaches design students, and her focus is on creating designs that are going to be great, that are for the industry, so that will be graded into multiple sizes. So creating standard size things. But she goes through how to create what's called a skirt sloper or a skirt block, where you start with a standard basis, like a basic skirt, like a straight skirt. You start with that, and then when you want to start designing with other add-ons, you can modify that. But the point is, you start with the skirt sloper, and then you sew a muslin. This is also a thing that's a new thing to me as in sewing, is that I never knew anything about doing a muslin before, like a practice one. I just bought the fabric and sewed it according to what the pattern said. So I'm learning so much, especially about like matching up patterns well, you know, and keeping the grain line. Like I've always known about grain line, but I've got better tips about keeping things on the grain. So I did my mock-up of my straight skirt. There's some tweaks that I need to make to this. Fit issues are fascinating to me. It's something that from knitting socks for so many people and seeing what their fit issues are and then figuring out how do you solve this fit issue, not just, well, you have to have this kind of heel because you have a high arch, or you are better off with this kind of heel because you have flat feet. Like I want to know, like, what if I want this kind of heel, but I also have a high arch? How do I do that? And so I figured out how to make those kind of fit modifications for socks. So it's really interesting now to come back to sewing and then look at the kind of fit adjustments that can be made. So also really interesting for me to look at like the main pattern companies' size charts, and that, you know, at the age I am now and having had a couple of kids, I finally fit on one size on the size charts. I used to be 3 sizes. I had a tiny, tiny waist, and then medium bust, and then I had a booty. So I didn't have wide hips, but I do have, you know, a booty. So now as I've aged and things have kind of settled in, I fit on one size chart. But it turns out that I really don't. So my bust, waist, and hip measurements are on the chart, but my high hip measurement is quite a bit smaller than would be normal. And my high bust measurement is larger, so I have broad shoulders. So I'm learning about how with a sewing pattern, they use, you know, cup sizes that they design based on a B cup. And sewing cup sizes are not the same as bra cup sizes. And even then, bra cup sizes are different from country to country and company to company. In the US, with bras, a cup size is relative to the band size. So saying that you're a C cup doesn't mean anything unless you also know the band measurement of the bra. But with sewing patterns, they take this high bust measurement under the arms and above any breast tissue. You take that measurement, that's your high bust measurement, and that is an indication of what your frame and your shoulder sizes are, and that's the place that's hardest to fit. And then they're assuming that your full bust is 2 inches larger than that. And if it's more than 2 inches larger, then you can do what's called a full bust adjustment. In my case, my full bust and my high bust are exactly the same. So if you're supposed to buy a sewing pattern based on your high bust measurement, but a lot of times they don't list that. You're just supposed to know that it's 2 inches bigger than whatever, or 2 inches smaller than what the bust measurement is listed. So I actually have to go up a size for anything for a bodice, and then I have to do what's called a small bust adjustment because my bust isn't 2 inches bigger than my high bust, and this is just because I have a torso that's V-shaped and broad shoulders. So that influences my frame shape. And then when you get down to my hips, I have a back that goes very straight down. It doesn't start coming out. So it goes very, very straight down, and then I have this protruding bottom. So even though my measurements are the same, it's not quite going to fit right. And so I've been learning a lot about how to manipulate darts. So I believe that what I'm going to have to use in the back, because I tried my mock-up skirt on and it actually fits super well in the front, like perfect in the front. It just looks very nice. And I think the side seams are straight. It's just that I have this extra fabric in the back. So I've been learning about different dart shapes and why you'd want to use them. And so I realized that what I need to do is what's called a convex dart in the back of my skirt. So I'm going to try that and see how that affects the fit of the mock-up. And then I'll get some fabric and knit a real skirt, or I keep saying knit, sew a skirt and then actually put a zipper in and then wear it and see how I think it feels before I graduate on to wool fabric with a lining. So it's been super fun. I'm having tons and tons of fun. And I can't wait to see how things progress with my sewing. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.